Hi everyone, Dr. Niall Curry here. It seems like there's already been quite an exciting morning of talks before us with focuses on personalised learning, mobile learning and engagement. And as part of the Insights on Demand event, I'm going to be talking about something slightly different. I'm going to move us into looking at corpus linguistics. What is corpus linguistics and how can it help with English language teaching and learning? And I'd like to thank Cambridge University Press and Cambridge Assessment English for inviting me to give a short talk on this quite interesting topic. So, to start, I think our first question really has to be, what is corpus linguistics? Have you heard about corpus linguistics before? What words come to mind when you think about corpus linguistics? So let me know, pop your answers in the chat. I'll be really interested to see what you say. And while you're doing that, I'm going to try and define, as much as I can in this short talk, I'm going to try and define the field of corpus linguistics, at least for us in the context of language education. So corpus linguistics involves the study of large databases of language known as corpora. These corpora come in lots of different shapes and sizes and lots of different modes, and they usually reflect written or spoken language or a combination of written and spoken language, and use this to kind of capture or reflect very specific communities of language users. And so in corpus linguistics, we talk about corpora being representative, and by that we mean that they represent a very specific community of users and the language used to communicate in different kinds of ways. So to kind of avoid talking any more abstractly about it, we might think about corpora of academic language. A lot of my work I've done on academic discourse, I've looked at research articles, the language of research articles written by specific disciplinary discourse communities, so like economics writers writing to other economics writers. We might think about spoken language contexts, and we might think about the example of the new BNC 2014, which is an 11 million word corpus of spoken casual British conversation. And my colleague Dr. Robbie Love will be talking about that tomorrow in his talk. We might think about learner language as well. So we could think about the language that learners use, such as the Cambridge Learner Corpus, and looking at how that tells us something about the language practices of learners in very different and specific kind of communities, first language backgrounds, specific test takers, etc. So corpus linguistics takes either large or often even quite small databases of language, depending on the community that we're trying to capture, and we use them to try and understand how language is used by specific communities and by specific users. And embedded within them is lots of useful information that we might call metadata, which is information that tells us about the people captured in the corpus. So it might tell us some of their demographic information, their ages, where they're from. It might tell us when the text was created, what kind of text it is, etc. And we can use all of this information to help make sure that what we've captured at every level of the corpus is representative of the community about whom we're speaking when we do kind of corpus linguistic research. And so there's a lot to it, and often what we will think of when we think about corpus linguistics is we talk about it being a principled collection of texts. So we have this kind of idea of texts that are chosen very carefully, that we pick these texts in order to be able to reflect the community that we're trying to study. And so that, in a nutshell, is what corpus linguistics is. If we start to then think about our current context, so we're talking about corpus linguistics and language education, let's try and zone in on what that means here. So really interesting work has taken place over the last 30, 40 years in the area of corpus linguistics, and kind of initially with this idea in the 90s of this kind of corpus revolution starting to take place, where we see work that looks to try and embed corpus linguistic practices in the practices of language professionals. So traditionally we might think of the use of corpus linguistics to inform dictionaries and learner dictionaries. Think of the Co-Build dictionary, the work by Sinclair, and the general use of corpus linguistics to inform lexicography, and something that's maintained strongly to this day. Then we might move into thinking about other areas of language education that corpus linguistics has played a role. For example, we could think about grammars, reference grammars, like the Cambridge Grammar of English, for example, that looks at that takes a very corpus-informed approach to being able to understand written and spoken grammar in contemporary English. And then I think when we look to where corpus linguistics has made inroads in language education elsewhere, there's not necessarily as much information available. And Professor Angela Chambers speaks about this in her more recent article on the corpus revolution, identifying that the revolution, I guess, is still very much underway, and there are still a lot of spaces in which corpus linguistics can get involved in language education. A very useful reference text that I use whenever I think about the application of corpus linguistics to language education is from Corpus to Classroom. And this text by O'Keefe, Carter and McCarthy looks at really interesting kind of ways in which you might be able to define the application of corpus linguistics to language education. And they draw on kind of wider literature in this area and pull together these kind of distinctions that we might call direct and indirect applications of corpus linguistics to language education. Direct applications is, as we might expect, the idea of corpora being used by learners and teachers in the language classroom to help get students to learn a little bit about language. We call this data-driven learning. It comes from Johns, and there's some really interesting work on this. Dr. Pascual Perez Paredes, who's going to be speaking tomorrow, has done lots of really interesting work in the area of data-driven learning and corpus linguistics. The other area that we might think about is indirect applications of corpus linguistics to language education, and these approaches are quite distinct. Within indirect applications of corpus linguistics to language education, what we see is the use of corpora in things like lexicography, as I mentioned, grammars, as I mentioned, and we could also see it in a couple of other areas. We could see it in things like teacher training, where corpora are being used to train teachers and develop their language awareness, and also kind of point them in the direction of where they might be able to solve problems that they're facing in trying to unpack and understand the language that they're teaching. We can also see corpus linguistics being used in the area of materials development, looking at course books, for example, and how corpus linguistics is being used to inform the development of course books and the language included within them. And also we might see corpus linguistics being used in areas like language assessment, so using corpora to help inform the way in which we understand our assessments and to unpack learners' engagement with these assessments to make sure that what we're doing is giving kind of equitable access to assessments, and that our marking criteria create a safe space for all kinds of students to be able to engage with assessment. So these are just some of the ways in which you might be able to see corpus linguistics informing language education. And for this short talk, what I want to do is spotlight on two particular examples. So the first example is corpora and coursebooks. So what can we say about corpus linguistics and their use in coursebook development? I think that this is a really burgeoning area of practice in the ELT sector, with more and more people interested in using corpora to inform the kind of language components of their course books. And I think we have to recognize, one of the key developers of corpus-informed course books is Professor Mike McCarthy, and he's done some really, really interesting work in this area. He also was responsible for the development of the Touchstone and Viewpoint course books that were corpus-informed, and when you look inside these course books, you see little examples of frequency information about particular items used in the course book that are drawing on the corpus information that they use. So this was kind of, I guess, one of the most comprehensive forays into the use of corpus linguistics to inform coursebook development. The way in which corpora are used are many-fold, so we might see them for creating word lists if we want to be able to look for thematic word lists or academic word lists, etc., to be able to inform curricula. We could also look at things like error reports. So we see people use things like error reports to identify the types of challenges that learners face surrounding particular grammatical or lexical constructs, and then being able to use this to guide the development of exercises to help learners work on these things. At a more macro level, we can see corpora being used to help develop grammar profiles for particular learner groups so that you can tailor coursebook kind of structures and the language and grammar that's included within them for particular audiences. And also we see corpora being used to be able to signal quite unique features of language or interesting uses of language that reflect this kind of like authentic language use, insider English type ideas from Evolve, register checks, etc. So the corpora being able to kind of really set in relief some of the interesting features of language that emerge from everyday use. Corpora can also help us dispel myths surrounding language, so we can use corpora to see whether or not certain idiomatic expressions are very common or not, and which ones we probably need to see less of. I'm thinking of "It's raining cats and dogs," for example. Probably not one that we need to see as often in coursebooks because it's not necessarily something that's spoken so widely. And in the context of corpora and assessment, what can we say? So where corpora and coursebooks is a relatively newer domain, what we can see is that in corpora and assessment, it is all the more recent. So research in this area is kind of moving on from the work of corpora in developing kind of courses and coursebooks to say, well, if we have coursebooks that are built around corpora, shouldn't our assessments match that in some way? This kind of constructive alignment idea, I guess. And in the context of assessment, what we might see is the use of learner corpora for helping us to identify the kinds of challenges that learners are facing when carrying out particular exams, and whether or not these challenges are related to the particular assessment itself, so whether there's an issue with the assessment, or whether particular groups of students are more likely to make particular problems when taking certain examinations. This is really helpful because using corpora in this way can help us look at issues of equity and accessibility in kind of global assessments, and in a way the corpora that allow us to kind of look in detail at specific subgroups of people who take these exams, they can help us to look at local issues in a global context, and in that sense they create a space for addressing issues of equity. So, for example, in a study that I worked on with a colleague at Cambridge Assessment English, Dr. Tony Clark, we looked at spelling errors in the preliminary B1 examination. And in that study, we found that speakers, it was focused on speakers from the MENA region, and we found that the students who undertook the examinations of the preliminary B1 in that context made proportionally a greater number of, and a significantly greater number of spelling mistakes when they're writing. Now, when we dug into this, we saw that there were all kinds of reasons for this. There were issues of kind of phonological transference, there were issues of a lack of kind of overlap between the sounds and the spelling of words between their first language and their second languages. And in general, we saw that, you know, in their first language, the kind of variability available to them in spelling that isn't necessarily translated to the English language practices meant that there were some contexts and some particular kinds of words that they were more inclined to misspell. Words, for example, beginning with W, words beginning with WH, things like this, and issues with vowel sounds and the representation of vowels on the page. So this was very interesting, and it helped us see that there were particular challenges that need to be met head on to make sure that students undertaking the preliminary B1 exam in this context from the MENA region, and they're not disadvantaged. And our initial approach to doing that was to kind of signal the need for more teacher development in these particular contexts, to draw attention to this particular spelling issue, and kind of help train teachers and students to kind of work on that with a particular focus in those contexts in order to support the students through the assessment. But it also makes us think a little bit about assessment criteria and how we can modify assessment criteria in order to balance out local issues in a global context. So corpora, again, in this sense, were very powerful in being able to help us identify these challenges and give us some maneuverability to move from and to help make decisions in the real world. So based on that very brief spotlight on corpora and coursebooks and corpora and assessment, what I'd love to know from you, and you can put your answers in the chat, is what do you think then the challenges are? And what are the opportunities, the affordances, the good things about using corpora in language education? So if you want to pop your answers in the chat, I will start to share what I think about that, and we can see whether or not we come up with the same things. So with that in mind, I guess we should all be using corpora all the time, right? Why aren't we all using corpora all the time? And I think that really comes down to the fact that there are also a number of challenges in using corpora in language education. And this is something that emerged in our study of the development of course books using corpora. One of the issues that emerged was the issue of representation. Whose language is captured in the corpus? Whose language are we trying to represent in our course books? And what can we do to kind of reconcile those two? And in some ways, when we're moving into this kind of context of English as an international language and more learner representation in course books and more representation of learner language as models, then the corpora that we're trying to capture are not based on necessarily kind of British standard or American standard all the time. And so we probably want to have a wider selection of representations of communities of speakers to help inform the language that we put into our course books. That's really hard to kind of create all of those databases, and so we're limited by the data that is available, which is a very real constraint. So that might be one of the challenges to using corpora in language education. I think another couple of challenges that are related somewhat and perhaps a little bit obvious is the impact of the technology. So there's a sense of the need for digital literacy surrounding the use of corpora. Can our teachers train to effectively use corpora? Do they know how to find what they're looking for, and do they know how to interpret what they've found? And how about students? How well are students trained, and how can we facilitate this? And probably all the more in this digital and distance context. And similarly, do we have the infrastructure? So is there space and resource available for us to be able to bring corpus linguistics into our practices? And that's not necessarily always the case. And I do think that while it's very useful to be aware of corpus linguistics and understand what it comes from, I don't think everyone needs to do it. I think that we can, for example, if we're using materials that are corpus informed, as long as we know what that means exactly, what language data it's based on, what it's been used for, then we don't necessarily need to reinvent the wheel every time and do the analysis ourselves. So it's just about finding the best way to incorporate it in for you and figuring out what challenges you need to address head on. I think a fourth point I want to make here that is quite critical is the importance of the focus of what we do with corpus. So we're focusing on language, which is obviously very important in language education, but it's not the only thing that matters. We've got lots of other things to think about. Depending on our students, we might want to bring in different topics, maybe topics that aren't necessarily captured in some of the corpora that we're looking at. And so we might not have all the language that we need about those particular items. We might want to bring in particular disciplinary foci in different contexts as well. And we may want to bring in a range of different items into a course book for a range of different reasons. And maybe frequency isn't the only thing that we need to think about in terms of language choice. Frequency also will tell us a lot about how frequent particular forms are, but we can also think about function and what kind of functions they break down into. So there's so much stuff that we need to think about when we're putting together materials or preparing our lessons in language education. And so we don't always need to go by frequency and the particular language item itself. There are other criteria too. And I think that these maybe are some of the challenges in using corpora for language education. However, I think that there are also many affordances, and I want to really stress the affordances in this talk too. One way I like to think about corpora for language education is that often when we have a challenge nowadays, we want to know how to do something or whether or not something should be included in something else. We want to find the conventions that are most typically used for anything that we're working on. We might Google it. We might say, how do I use apostrophes? Do I use them before the S or after the S? Things like that. However, if what you want is a question about language use, what we realize is that language use is extremely variable, and you'll find the answer to any question that you probably search for saying, yes, your way is right in some contexts, in some ways. What are those ways? And that's where a corpus can come in. They can help us answer specific questions about communities that we're studying, so we don't have to kind of Google wildly to try and figure out whether or not this particular language is used by people. We can find out who's saying it and when they're saying it and in what context and for what purposes, and it helps us answer specific questions. A lot of my work is in the area of academic writing and academic discourse, and one thing, for example, people often ask me is whether they should use passive voices or the first person in their writing. And I think, in general, I try not to be prescriptive in saying you should or you shouldn't, but what I do say is, well, it would be useful to know what the conventions in your community are, and then you can decide whether you want to follow those conventions or if you want to flout them. So that gives kind of, the choice. And the way we find that out is by doing a corpus search to look for passive structures, see when they're used. You might find that they're not very often used except for in very specific contexts where they're very useful, for example in method sections of papers. And so that helps answer questions that we can't really solve otherwise. There isn't really a repository of answers for these very specific questions. Corpora can also help personalize learning, so they can help us create learning materials that are very much based on the community of speakers for whom we're making them, but also models of those speakers, for those speakers of people who are maybe like them who have learned English. So we can really personalize them. Also in terms of content and topic, we can create disciplinary corpora for academic contexts, for example, in order to be able to find the language of neuroscience, for example. We can use corpora to raise teachers' language awareness and give them a space to be able to solve their language-related problems that are not necessarily easily solved otherwise. And also corpora give us the opportunity to bring authentic language use into the classroom. And authentic language use, especially, for example, in the context of spoken language, can be quite interesting because it has lots of things that we might not necessarily expect. Lots of hesitations, lots of sentences that we might consider broken sentences or non-grammatical, but in reality they just reflect what people do with language when we speak. Bringing things like that in can be hard. It can be difficult for students to understand it, but it is what they're going to hear when they get out there in the world and listen to people. And the challenge is a good thing to bring into a safe space where they can be challenged. And once they learn to kind of navigate these more complex texts, spoken or written, it helps build their confidence as well. And so corpora can help slowly enculture them into the language used by particular groups, and probably the groups that they want to start speaking into in their future as well. So a lot of really, I think, strong advantages of corpora there. So where do we go from here? I'd be interested to kind of think about what we can do with corpora moving forward. And I think as teachers, what we do best is experiment. And I think finding a space where you can use corpora in some way or another to play around with them, to figure out, come up with some questions and try and see if you can get some answers, and to find spaces and maybe collaborative spaces with some of your colleagues at work to work on corpora together. Okay, so you want to do that, you want to experiment with corpora, you probably need some corpora or you need some technologies to be able to do it. So let's think a little bit about the technologies and tools that you might want to use. So there are myriad examples that I could give, and we don't have enough time to go through them all, but I thought I'd give you a selection of a couple of different technologies that have some corpus input to varying degrees. So one particular tool that you could look at is the BAW Quick Links project. This project looks at how we can use corpora like the BAW corpus, which is an academic writing corpus of British English, of student writing, to be able to link to example sentences for feedback purposes. So you can, if someone's made a particular grammatical or lexical mistake where they've confused words or different items, you can link to specific examples of sentences that reflect what they were trying to do. So you can encourage them to look at these examples and figure out what they did wrong with their answers. We also have the likes of Write and Improve. So Write and Improve is a technology that gives automatic feedback on grammatical and syntactic issues in writing, and it's based on the Cambridge Learner Corpus. I recently did a study of this with my colleague, Dr. Lynn Reardon at the University of Limerick, and we looked at how teachers and students use Write and Improve and found lots of really interesting things about its impact, positive impact on student motivation and kind of writing processes, etc. Other technologies like Collocate talk about collocational behavior of academic words and how we might be able to use corpora to guide the development of writing in a feed-forward way, not a feedback way. So it's kind of inductive in that it gives you ideas of how you might add collocations to particular words to kind of better communicate what it is you're trying to say. Other tools like Scout, which is Sketch Engine for language learning, allow you to kind of access relationship between words. And if you're interested in digging more deeply into corpora, the likes of Sketch Engine as a web-based corpus analysis software is very useful and has access to loads of different corpora and web corpora as well that you can just pick up and search on the go. There are lots of other technologies that you could look at, the likes of Lancsbox developed at Lancaster. There's also the BNC Lab, which Dr. Robbie Love is going to talk about tomorrow. And then we have other software that you can use offline, like AntConc. AntConc is a good tool to get stuck in with if you're really interested in starting with corpora. It's easy enough to use, and it has a lot of supports online on the website, Lawrence Anthony's website for the technology. And he also has a suite of other tools available that you can use alongside it, one of which, if you're interested in the area of academic language, is very useful. It's called AntCorGen, and it's a software that generates corpora based on research articles, and you can choose from a wide selection of disciplinary areas. So you could make very personalized corpora for your students that you're teaching. So a lot of choice out there for us to kind of get stuck into using corpora in our language education practices. So to close on this very short talk, what can I say? I think in a first instance, what I would like to say is that there are more corpus talks to come. So tomorrow we have some talks from Dr. Robbie Love on spoken language and corpus linguistics. And we have talks from Professor Pascual Perez-Paredes, who's going to be speaking about English medium instruction contexts and corpus use by learners in the classroom as well. So really interesting stuff there. And I think that we can also think a little bit about this idea of experimentation in corpus linguistics and where we're going from here. There's a lot of us are working in multilingual contexts, so we could think about the impact of multilingual corpora on language education and being able to do comparative and contrastive studies of learners groups to be able to see what kind of challenges they may face when they're switching between or translanguaging in a sense between their repertoires of language. And when we think about this plurilinguistic competence that we're trying to instill in our students, perhaps multilingual corpora create a good opportunity for that. We can think about English as an international language and who we put in our corpora and what we're trying to represent. And I think that's really at the core, one of the most important things is who we're trying to capture in this data. And even things like multimodal corpora. As language teachers, we engage with multimodal work all the time, visuals, images, sound, etc. And we think of things like the multisensory approach for being effective, for being able to help students with specific learning needs, and also, I think more widely, for creating multiple modes can make things more accessible. So multimodal corpora are an interesting kind of innovation that are ongoing and a challenge really in the field of corpus linguistics, but I think may have really useful implications for language education in the future. So that was a whistle-stop tour through corpus linguistics. I hope that you found that relevant and interesting to your overall practices, and I'm really excited to see any questions that you may have in the chat. So thank you for coming along, and again, thank you to the Insights On Demand event team for having me give this talk.